Hi, welcome back to the Abba Podcast. I hope you had a great Christmas and New Year break. We've taken a little bit of an extended break, but we're back now. And my guest today is Natalie Collins, a gender justice specialist. And if you're not sure what that is, don't worry, she explains it in our chat. But just to warn you that this conversation is tackling the subject of domestic abuse. So if that's something you're sensitive to, just be aware that that's what the subject is today. But I had a great time with Natalie. She's an amazing person, and I'm sure you will love her and love what she has to say. Here is the interview. Well, it's my great pleasure to welcome Natalie Collins onto the Abba Podcast. Natalie, good morning.
Morning.
Great to see you.
Morning.
And Natalie is the author of a book called Out of Control. And we're going to talk a little bit about that book. But Natalie, in the book, you describe yourself as a gender justice specialist. What is that?
Well, if you were surprised because you didn't know what it was, that's fine, because I made the title up. I've spent over a decade, about 12 years, working on issues around male violence and women's rights. That's including doing lots of stuff around domestic abuse, child sexual exploitation, some stuff around female genital mutilation, some stuff within the church about sexism and about a lack of representation of women on the platform. I'm one of the people who organise Project 328, and in the church what we do is we count the number of men and women on the National Christian platform, and then we release the stats every year, and we have a database for women who can speak at Christian events called Speaker 328.info. It comes from Galatians 3:28. There's neither male or female, we're one in Christ.
What is that website again?
Speaker 328.info. Basically women can register as a speaker, and then event organisers can register and they can find women to speak at their events, because that was one of the big challenges that event organisers said, well, we asked a woman but she couldn't make it, and we were like, there's definitely more than one woman you can so I've done lots of different things. I set up a campaign about the 50 Shades series a few years ago, the book series, and we protested some of the premieres. So I do all these different stuff, and I also do some stuff where I'm on radio and on television and that kind of thing. And so often they want a neat title of what you do, and saying, I'm an expert in domestic abuse sounds like I'm an expert in doing it. Which isn't really what you want. And so I kind of settled on gender justice specialist, which is a bit tricky because then you have to kind of spend all your time explaining it. But so it's for me, gender equality is a bit of a sort of it sounds kind of optional, whereas gender justice, particularly from a faith point of view, that as Christians we are committed to seeing justice enacted. And so I think for me there's something much stronger about talking about gender justice than gender equality. And actually I think it's quite misleading, the idea of equality, because it sounds like we all just need the same things, whereas actually justice is about recognizing that different people need different things in order to thrive and flourish, rather than that we all just need to, if we just everybody got the same thing, it would be fine. So I think equality itself is a bit of a problematic framing of this stuff. So that's how I came up with calling myself a gender justice specialist.
Great. And of course you're a Christian. How did you become a Christian? Were you young or later in life? How did that happen?
Yeah, so I grew up. My parents. After they got together, they became Christians. They'd both been previously married, and they went to one church that didn't like the fact they weren't married and they were living together, and before I was born. And then they went to the Salvation Army, because they said, the Salvation Army will have everyone. So then when I was born into a very kind of evangelical, conservative family, and so grew up going to church. And it was, it was one of the biggest joys of growing up in that faith. I think it's probably one of the things that's quite different in the US to the UK about being raised in an evangelical family, that it didn't come with a lot of the sort of fear fear stuff that I think comes with US evangelicalism. I think in the UK it was, it was like being part of this massive church family. We'd do bring and shares. Like I remember one time when we couldn't go to church for some reason, that I was like, we've got to have a service at home, and we got the Vitalite tub out to do the collection for the communion for collection, and we did all that stuff. And so I grew up like just always knowing God was real, always knowing Jesus, always not necessarily ever having heard from God for myself or anything like that, but just this kind of sense of this is true, this is real. And by the time I got to being a teenager, I really wanted everybody to become Christian, saw it as my job to bring Jesus to them. Like it wasn't my job to save them, it was Jesus's job, but it was my job to get Jesus to save them. And so I was very passionate evangelist. Everywhere I went, I was telling people about Jesus, to a degree that was quite problematic, really. So yeah,
I think we've all been there.
Yeah. So and then things got a bit more complicated when I got into my late teens. But yeah, like my faith comes from this kind of being born and raised within a Christian family, and then it became more complicated as I got a bit older.
Yeah, wow, that's amazing. Because for people like me, I didn't grow up in that kind of atmosphere, so the whole thing of becoming a believer was interesting.
Well, I find it really interesting. I love hearing stories of people who became Christians as adults, particularly, or became Christians when they come from a non-Christian context, because I have absolutely like my entire childhood was like infused with this concept of faith and of Jesus. Like my parents they weren't really a fan of all the spiritual gift stuff. They were like, I was born in the 80s, and so like my early childhood, or mid childhood, was around the time of the Toronto blessing. So so there was a lot of toxicity around kind of spiritual gifts, so my parents were really cynical and quite so I was raised with this quite cynical idea of spiritual gifts, but also like we were quite poor, working class, and like literally my mum and dad would be like, we need to pray that God will give us some money, and then the next morning they'd be like, there was money on the side this morning, like, do you know, like that was like, so it was this really crazy growing up in this time where like God was really tangible and real and provided for us, and and that kind of thing. But yeah, so I love hearing from people who that's not their background, but I find it's one of those things where I love hearing how God has moved in people's lives, but there is a kind of disconnect, because it's just I've always known God is real and Jesus is real, and all that stuff has always been true for me. So it's a weird to be if that's not your story.
That's awesome. That's interesting. You're saying about your parents really were a bit wary of spiritual gifts, because didn't I read in your book that when you were born they were going to a Pentecostal church?
Yeah, they were in an Elim Pentecostal church.
I used to get pastored in Elim.
That's probably why they were really cynical. by the time I was like 2, we'd moved to a middle of the road Anglican church. Right. I think it was too much for them all.
Much more sober.
Yeah, well, it was more just like, I think, I mean, there was a lot of stuff, wasn't there, around that time that was just really dodgy, and was a lot of wacky stuff. Good kind of, it was just weird stuff going on. So I can appreciate it, but I think as I've become an adult, my own experience of God and of spiritual gifts has been very different to my parents. Sure. I think so. Yeah.
But I mean, I don't know how you've got on now up in Sunderland, but I know that you were quite involved in church, and you did the puppets and all of that kind of stuff. And
so we helped to plant a church when we were in Essex before we moved to Sunderland, and we'd helped to plant a church there, and then subsequently left there and we were part of, so when me and my husband first got married, we were part of like an free church, well, not free church, I don't know, non-denominational kind of network of churches, and then we ended up leaving there and going kind of, tried Baptist church for a couple of years and ended up in a Church of England church. And yeah, for us, before we moved up, we'd been there about 7 years. I preached regularly in the church. And then when we moved up to Sunderland, obviously it was during lockdown, so we moved up in June. So we haven't found a new church yet. So for a while, I was taking the service once a month, doing a puppet, like a all-age service using puppets. So did that for a few months, but now haven't been able to continue that. But yeah, so I've always been involved in church. and since we like I guess I probably for the last 10 years, preaching has been one of the things that I feel called to. And it's one of the tests of whether we should stay in a church is A, whether women preach, and B, whether when I ask them if I can preach, whether, I mean, I'm not like, it's not like on week 2, but it's if there's not many women preaching, then I'm like, can I preach? Because that's the test of whether they think women can preach. Because if it's like, well, we just don't have any women, like, hi, I'm here. So yeah,
pick me.
Yeah. We've always been. My husband plays guitar and piano and stuff, so we've always been quite involved in like church stuff. But
that's interesting. It's because generally in church, it's like the husband comes as the preacher, and you know the question is always, is your wife musical?
yeah. Well, this is it. It's funny, when we went to the church, our last church, we arrived, and within like less than a month, I'd had a word with whether I'd like to help with the kids' work. Like, it happened literally immediately, and I was like, no. I mean, I can do kids' work. It's not that I can't do it, but it's definitely not where I'm called to be. So I think it is really interesting, the assumptions that are made when a new family join the church, what people are gifted in, and yeah, I think preaching is a tricky one, isn't it? Because like there's a great responsibility with that. So when you go into a new church, you can't just like roll up and be like, hi, hi, you should let me preach. Like, so I do think it is more complex. I mean, I guess
that's what I've been doing wrong.
To be fair, though, they're happy for you to look after their kids, which I'd say out of the two.
I know.
I always think it's funny when people think that women are allowed to help with the kids and look after the kids, but they're not allowed to preach. I'm like, look, if you don't trust them with the adults, don't let them anywhere near those young, gradually growing minds.
Yeah, I hadn't thought of that, but yeah, you've got a point there.
Yeah.
So in amongst all of this, you've also written a book called Out of Control. Now, what's it about? What's the story?
Yeah, so the book was published in 2019, and it's published by SPCK, and I'm just like, I should have a much more smoother answer about what this book is about. It's a really complex, intertwined book. I think that while the general kind of, if you were to give it in a, your elevator talk, the like lift, if you've got 2 minutes, what do you say the book's about? I'd say it's a book about helping people to understand where something, where relationships move from being kind of problematic or difficult into somebody being abusive to another person. It's written for a Christian audience, but it's definitely been written in a way that's accessible to non-Christians or people of other faiths. Anytime I get into kind of Christian stuff, I'm a bit like, don't worry, I know this is a bit weird, but we'll get back to non-weird stuff soon.
I'm obviously in the process of reading the book, and I don't find it necessarily specifically a Christian book.
No.
Although you obviously, your faith is a part of who you are and part of your experience and everything else. But I think it's very accessible for people who have no faith at all.
Yeah, definitely. I think I've got lots of friends who are not Christian. So, I think it is that I wanted to write something that was that really dealt with the stuff that Christians face, but I didn't want to make it so that, not because I do lots of work outside of the Christian world, so I didn't want to kind of only have it available to Christians. But yeah, so the idea really is for friends and family and church leaders and people who work within in kind of caring professions and that kind of stuff. The idea is the book will give you a really robust understanding of what domestic abuse is, of why somebody perpetrates domestic abuse, and why and how do we go about making a difference around that. But it's been written in a way that's also for if somebody themselves feels like they might have been subjected to abuse or they're struggling in their relationship, it's written in a way that hopefully is accessible for them too. However, like the book cover doesn't say anything about domestic abuse. It's called Out of Control, Couples Conflict and the Capacity for Change. And the reason why it's really difficult to tell people what it's about is because if I say it's about domestic abuse, people won't want to read it and they'll think, oh, it's got nothing to do with me.
But because instantly that creates an image or an idea in people's minds, doesn't it? If you say it's about abuse.
Yeah, people think that, so one of the big challenges we have with responding to issues around abuse is that people who are being abused think it happens to those women, you know, not like me. And the family and friends of people who are being abused think, oh no, well it can't be that because we're a nice, he's a lovely man, or you know, she's very empowered, she's got a very well paid job, you know, it can't be abused because she's not one of those women. And so there's these kind of those women and those men myths which really underpin why it's so hard for us to understand this. And I think the term abuse or domestic abuse or domestic violence, those sorts of terms, they're a bit like a bomb going off in our lives. And if we don't think it's abuse, if we think it's just, oh, it's a difficult relationship, or he's struggling a bit, or you know, I'm making things difficult at the minute, you know, all of those sorts of reframing it as something like that's not abuse, we don't have to deal with all the stuff that when we label abuse comes up. Because if it's abuse, he's probably not going to change. If it's abuse, I'm going to have to take steps. If it's abuse, then that means my children's father is abusive, and or you know, my brother's abusive, or you know, or the church leader's abusive, or whatever it is. And so we are psychologically really invested in it not being abuse. And so the really tricky thing about writing a book about abuse is, in order for people to read it, they've got to think they're not reading a book about abuse. So it's tricky because actually everybody needs to know this. 25% of women will be subjected to abuse by a partner. 72% of girls will be emotionally abused by a boyfriend by the time they're 16. About 10 to 20% of men are abusive. So this is not something, you know, like we have this, I think a lot of people who are outside of this world, they think it's maybe like 1 or 2% of the population, and that they could probably go through life never knowing anybody who's being abused or being abused. That is impossible. There is no way in the UK that you could go through life and never have spoken to or interacted with or had a relationship with somebody who has been subjected to abuse, you know, like, because it's just so common. And I think that's one of the tricky things, that it gets put over here in a box because we don't want to believe that anyone we know could be abusive. We monster abusers, they're awful, you know. This is what you see anytime, you know, somebody perpetrates abuse and it's broadcast, there's this kind of monstering of them. They're not really a proper human being, they're something other. And so then we don't have to face the fact that in my family, in my amongst my colleagues, in my church community, there's probably somebody who's doing things like that to their partner. And so so that the book is about trying to help people unpick that, but the biggest barrier is getting people to want to read a book that's about a topic they really don't want to believe they need to know anything about. So it's a hard marketing, you know, to get.
Well, that's the thing, isn't it? Because people, if it's marketed as a book about abuse, then people think, well, that's not relevant to me.
Exactly.
Even if they are suffering abuse.
Exactly. Even if they're currently being subjected to abuse, they will. One of the big problems is people do not self-identify that they're being abused. So, like the idea, you know, like you go to safeguarding training and they're like, give you a scenario, like a case study to work on. And it's like, this woman comes to you and tells you her husband's abusing her. Like that's just not, like, it's not, that never happens. Abuse is almost always accidental. Disclosure is almost always accidental and usually gradual. So when somebody starts disclosing its abuse, they won't be like, I'm being abused. They'll be like, they'll start telling us the least worst things that their partner's done, and then wait to see how are we going to react, because they won't necessarily know they're doing this. It'll be subconscious, but they're testing the water. How is this person going to react to the least worst thing? And so if we kind of immediately jump into the like, oh well, I'm sure we didn't mean it, that sounds like a misunderstanding, we're immediately showing that we're not somebody safe for that person to talk to. And so I think this whole kind of tricky thing around self-identification and either other identification, so even people around us recognizing it's abuse, even that's pretty poor, I think, as a society. So as I said earlier, I set up a campaign about the 50 Shades series, and we did a load of media stuff about it a few years ago. And so I was on this radio program, some national radio station in Ireland, I think it was. And while I was on air, they were doing a poll among their listeners to say, do you think that 50 Shades is abuse? Do you think that book is about abuse? Now, I can tell you, as a specialist in abuse, that's what that book's about. That book is about abuse. And I'm not talking about the kind of alternative sexuality that is, you know, actually everything he does, he controls who she speaks to, he controls the contraception she uses, he buys the company she works for so he can control where she works. You know, like, he's very, very controlling. And so anyway,
I've never read it and I've never seen it, and I've known.
So if you want like a brief overview of what the storyline is, the storyline is that Christian Grey finds women who looks like his mother, because his mother abused him as a child. Well, his mother didn't abuse him. His mother's boyfriend abused him. So he likes to find women who look like his mother, not like the boyfriend who actually abused him. He likes to find women who look like his mother and then sexually punish them by having BDSM sexuality. That's basically
his mom.
Yeah, because he wants to, that's the basic narrative of the book. Like, it's not, you won't hear that in any of the kind of synopsis, but that's what the series of the 3 books is about the fact that he likes to find women who look like his mother to punish them. So anyway, so the book is fundamentally about abuse. Like, there's just no way you could do, but anyway, in this poll that they did on this radio station, 97% of their listeners said it wasn't abuse. And so the presenter was like, see, so what do you say to that? And what I say to that is that we have very low literacy about abuse, that anybody could read 50 Shades and think it's about anything other than abuse. Just shows how many people wouldn't recognize abuse if they were being subjected to it, or if someone they know was being subjected to it. So yeah, so the book is really designed to help people to recognize abuse. It also talks about stuff around pornography, around masculinity, around how do we raise children to make healthy relationship choices. So it's a really kind of comprehensive book, but it's hard to kind of put into like just the 3 sentences in a way that's accessible to people who, and help them to realize why they should read it, if that makes sense.
Yeah, no, that's great, Natalie. Thank you. And it's interesting. My mum was a women's rights officer in Stirling Council when she's retired over 20 years now. And back then it was the zero tolerance campaign. And it was domestic violence that was being addressed, but you don't call it domestic violence, do you?
No, I mean, it's been a shift over the last few years. So, you know, in the 70s, the first people who really advocated that domestic and sexual violence was like bad, you know, like really actually bad, were feminists in the kind of 60s and 70s. And there were kind of first wave feminists in the kind of Victorian era and beyond, who generally were motivated by their faith, interestingly. So somebody like Josephine Butler, who she fought for the repeal of the Contagious Diseases Act, and that act basically meant that that because there was lots of sexual STDs being passed by soldiers and others using women exploited in prostitution for sex, and basically there was STDs all over, venereal disease. And so they brought in this act that meant that women who were in prostitution could be dragged in, forcibly investigate, check to see if they had a venereal disease, and then kept imprisoned for 6 months until it had gone. And the men there was no problem. The men could continue to use women for sex and pay them, but the women would get, you know. And so Josephine Butler in the late 1800s, early 1900s, that was kind of, I'm rubbish at dates. But anyway, so she kind of fought against that act and got it repealed. And she was motivated by her faith. She set up groups of people around the UK praying. And what she did was as significant in some ways as what William Wilberforce did, but nobody had ever heard of her. And the abuse that she suffered was horrendous, from people saying that she shouldn't do this, and the church was, some churches were involved. But anyway, so generally though, kind of, if we look historically, the first people who identified that in the home, families were not this haven of rest and recuperation, and weren't this kind of haven of loveliness, that actually there was a significant proportion of men who were abusing either their wives or their children, particularly sexually with their children. And Freud had realized this. So Freud, back in the day, Freud recognized, he wrote a paper called The Etiology of Hysteria. And he argued that actually the reason why there was this big, lots and lots of women were suffering from really serious mental health problems, which were described as hysteria. The reason it's called hysteria, as an aside, is because it's to do with they thought that it was to do with your womb that made you hysterical, which is why hysterectomy and hysteria have got the same root word, because this idea that women's wombs were like causing them to go mad. Anyway, so Freud came into this context where the idea was women are going mad because of their wombs, and he basically spoke to lots of women and established that actually all these women had been sexually abused, often by their fathers, often by other men. So he wrote this paper saying the etiology of oppression, the kind of root of oppression, is male sexual violence towards women. And within 2 years he had recanted that analysis, because it was this realization that if he was right, there was large scale sexual violence from men towards women and girls. And so basically he like rejected that analysis. So it's not that there hasn't been people before the 60s and 70s who said this, but in the 1960s or 70s, feminists started to really strongly articulate this idea that the family wasn't safe, and part of what that involved was developing a terminology. And so domestic violence was part of that, and very much, you know, that was within a context where what we were seeing was women being badly beaten. And so over the years, as feminist theory and practice has developed, and as research around how men perpetrate abuse has developed, there's been a recognition that violence is much more complex than simply physically hurting another person, that there's these other forms of violence. And so what happened was, over time, there was this recognition that the term violence did not, even if those who were in the field understood that domestic violence meant all the, you know, mental violence, emotional violence, actually for the general public, when you say domestic violence, what people hear is he's hit her, and what women who are being abused feel is, oh well, he's not hit me, he's not being violent to me. And so the term domestic abuse has come in to try to ensure that people can see themselves in that experience, in what that term speaks of. So domestic abuse is now the kind of much more widely used term, though I think, you know, all of the things that are abuse are also forms of violence, but I think that requires a kind of a developed understanding of what violence is, in a way that lots of people just don't get. So I think that's why we've seen that shift. It wasn't like a formal, it's not like you look in a history book and go, and this day, this is the problem with a lot of women's history. So much of women's history is not recorded because we only tell, you know, men's history, really. And so
the victor writes the story, isn't it? That's generally the way it is.
Yeah, and even I think the powerful write the story. So even if it's not a case of the loser doesn't get to tell it, I don't know whether women are the losers in this, because we've fought and seen lots and lots of changes. But actually, when you go to, you know, when you go through school, you don't learn about feminist history. You just learn about men's history, because, you know, why would it be important to know about things women have done? Who knows? Why? Why would we even need
about the wars? You learn, you know, all of that kind of stuff. But it's fascinating to me that this is something that's been going on for centuries. You know, you were talking about the early feminists, and you know, I was reading about a lady called Lucretia Mott. She was a Quaker. But you're talking, that was the 1800s, when she was campaigning for women's safety, as well as campaigning against slavery. You know, and you quote Sarah Grimke in your book as well. And that's the early 1800s. She was, you know, it's incredible that we're still talking about these issues more than a century later.
Yeah, and I think, you know, the reality is that one of the tricky things about feminism is when any woman wakes up and goes, oh, it's quite hard to be a woman. Like that, like basically in a way that it's not hard to be a man. Like obviously lots of people wake up and realize that it's hard because they're poor, or because of capitalism, or because of whatever. But actually feminism is when women wake up and go, oh, it's really hard to be a woman. And so unlike Marxism, where Marx kind of sat down in the British Library, created a system, created what Marxism was, feminism is much, much more complicated, because it's wherever women realize things are difficult. And because we don't tell women's history, this, you know, before Sarah Grimke, before Lucretia Mott, before, you know, at any time where women have been on this planet and there has been patriarchal oppression and male violence towards women, there will have been women working to combat that. But the tricky thing is, we don't hear those stories. We don't have that. We don't have those narratives. You know, we don't have kind of social history. You know, it's not recorded as often. And so So I think it is sad because we're constantly reinventing the wheel, because every woman who wakes up and realizes it's hard to be a woman often will never realize that that makes them a feminist, and often won't then have access to feminist history. And so every woman, not every woman, but most women are waking up to this and then trying to make a difference in a context where they don't even necessarily know what that's called, and so I think it does create real challenges to creating a cohesive movement for change, because also what is going to make that woman's life better and what is going to make the women in her context better might actually make women's life worse in this context, in a different context. So for instance, within the West we have the kind of industrial revolution led to this idea that women should be housewives and stay at home while men go out and do the work. Now, that's not a kind, the Christians sometimes have this idea that that's what God ordained things to be. Like, it just didn't exist. Like, that was the Bible did not have housewives. Like, it's just like a really
women were in the fields, they were milking the cows, they were digging the soil.
That people worked as households, and that actually there's something really interesting about the fact that the biblical model is one where a household works in partnership together, and that we don't have the facility for most people to do that anymore. And so for the West, in the 70s and 80s, this kind of rejection of the housewife and women being able to go out to work was very liberatory for lots of women. But if you look in other parts of the world where women are expected to do hard labor, get up at 3:30 in the morning, cook their husband's dinner, cook their son's dinner, then they've got to do like 12 hours work, and then they might get some food themselves. Actually, you know what? I think some of those women were quite welcome, like, to be a housewife. So this idea,
it's interesting because some of the countries I've visited, the men are lazy so-and-sos.
Yeah.
It's the women that go and do everything.
Yeah. Well, this is it. And I think it's, it's interesting. I was in a debate with a complementarian pastor a while ago, and like a lot of the kind of thing around complementarians is, that actually men are called to protect women, and even in like persecution, men are called to kind of die first, take the bullet first. That is the call of the man. Like, that is just not what you actually see across human history of men and women's relationships, and it's not what we see around the world. The persecution that women are subjected to across the world as Christians is compounded by the fact that they're already subjected to violence from being women by the men in that are also Christians, that they're already dealing with male violence and sexism and patriarchy and misogyny, and then on top of that they're also abused because of their faith. So it's not like in context of persecution women are having an easier time of it than the men who are going forward and doing that. Actually, they're dealing with this kind of double weight of pain that the men don't have to deal with. And I think there is kind of this perpetuation of this idea that women are delicate, and look at like the Victorian women, like where they were wearing clothes where they physically could barely move, like, but actually, do you know how heavy those dresses were? Like, these women would have had to be quite strong just to physically wear the dresses
with
that they were.
whalebone corsets and
it's shocking when you kind of like take the whole kind of picture. And I think a lot of the time the reason that we're in these conversations where there isn't that recognition is because we're just looking at our tiny window here and going, this is how it is here, and so we can kind of extrapolate that, and you can't. It's a much more complex picture.
So it's really interesting because obviously you are an expert in this area. How do you integrate faith with what you do and what you see, and how does that impact you faith-wise?
Yeah, I mean, it's an interesting one because it's a struggle within the feminist world. Like, quite rightly, feminists are quite suspicious or anti-faith. That faith has been used against women forever to, since Eve. We talk about like Eve being responsible for the, eating the apple, but like, there's lots of kind of theologians who say, well, there's evidence that Adam didn't tell her she shouldn't eat it. Like, so actually, is she responsible? And B, like, when God's like, you did this, and Adam's like, wasn't me. Like, it was like Shaggy, like that Shaggy song. It was like that, but like, the first time a man was asked to be held accountable for what he'd done wrong, he's like, it wasn't me, it was that woman that you gave me. So it's the woman's fault, it's God's fault. Who it's not the fault of is the man, right from the beginning.
and we men still do it.
Yeah, I think there is I think both, it's a human condition to be in denial and refuse to take responsibility, but I think it's something we definitely see within male perpetration, is this avoidance of responsibility.
And within the context of what we're talking about, it's like, I don't know if you talk about it in the book, but it's like, well, look at what she's wearing.
Yeah, victim blaming.
It's like,
constantly, lots and lots of the ways that, when men have affairs, the question is, well, why wasn't he happy at home? When men are violent, well, what did she do to wind him up? When men are sexually violent, well, what was she wearing? All of that kind of stuff. And I think, when men are subjected to harm, rarely is it the man's fault. There's lots of things that might be at fault, but if a man is raped, nobody says, and what was he wearing? That's not what's going to be asked. And I mean, the vast majority of rape happens within prison to men. That's where men are generally, or potentially within the military as well. But I think actually the kind of blaming narratives are definitely very different for male victims, and obviously when anyone's victimized, that's terrible. So I think since Eve, theology and faith and Christianity and other faiths, there has been blaming of women, the mistreatment of women layered on, kind of what God wants for women. And so across history, I can understand why the feminist movement has been found faith to be very problematic. However, every single institution in the world is patriarchal and problematic. You look at Hollywood, we don't go, right, well, we shouldn't make films anymore because of Harvey Weinstein. We don't look at British gymnastics and go, right, well, we shouldn't do, have competitive gymnastics because of what Larry Nassar did. We don't look at, or, we don't look at these other institutions. And I think obviously the religious institutions have a different, an additional layer in that there's a morality that comes along with them, and that this isn't just about a kind of making nice entertainment or or music, creating nice music. This is about kind of fundamental to something about the soul of who a human is, and that religions are trying to speak into. So I understand it's a bit even more complicated. However, for me, growing up in the church, I learned a lot of really problematic stuff. So I loved growing up in the church, but I learned a lot of problematic stuff about what it meant to be a woman and what relationships meant and how we should enact relationships. I learned that, don't have sex before marriage, but didn't learn anything about consent and didn't learn anything about actually not having sex before marriage. It's not like it's not going to fix the fact that male violence exists. It's not going to fix the fact that actually there's coercion and that kind of thing. And I learned that it's my job to save people. I learned, it's my job to get Jesus to save people, which kind of basically just means that, it's still my job. It's my job, that forgiveness is really crucial, and not that forgiveness isn't crucial, but actually that essentially you should just kind of like forget stuff. Why, that forgiveness is wiping the slate clean.
Well, forgiveness is used as a way of glossing over things, isn't it?
Yeah, and I think, the type of forgiveness we hear God offering us, wash me and I'll be whiter than the snow. Like, I'm not sure that is exactly how forgiveness is framed for one human being to another. And even when Jesus washes us and we're whiter than the snow, like, we still have to deal with the consequences. If I chop someone's leg off and then they forgive me, they still are going around with just one leg. Like, God doesn't like make everything better. Like, the consequences of sin remain, even though forgiveness liberates. Do you know what I mean? Like, and that's the tension of being in a faith. But actually that's not, I grew up with this kind of idea that forgiveness was just about wiping that slate clean. So I grew up with lots of really tricky messages about what it meant to be a girl, what it meant to be, and my parents were quite like, my brother was never allowed guns, that my dad was like quite was not hyper masculine, but my mum was a housewife, and so there was this kind of, this is the roles that women kind of don't really. My mum never learned to drive, for instance, and that wasn't necessarily a Christian faith thing, but when you're young, you just, all of that, whatever's different about your situation, you create a narrative around and a kind of framework around that. And for me, it was all mixed up with being a Christian and being in a Christian family and how women should be. And we went to a church where women in leadership, I think one of my vicars was probably one of the first women who was ordained, so it wasn't, so anyway, And so I grew up with all these ideas about what it meant to be a Christian. And then when I was 17, I met a boy who was the same age as me, and he said he was a Christian. So that was the big box ticked. That's all you need to do. Make sure you don't have sex, and that he's a Christian in the end. And so actually it turned out he wasn't a Christian, but nobody had taught me that, you've got to do some discerning. Like, it's just, yes, he's washed in the blood, he prayed the prayer, he's in, the end. So I ended up in this relationship, and I said I didn't want to have sex before marriage. I thought that was all you had to do, just say it, that's it, and then they respect it at the end. And actually, within 12 days, he'd coerced and manipulated me and essentially sexually abused me into a sexual activity. Within 6 months, I'm pregnant. But by the time I'm 18, I'm married, because that was the only way to, really, as a Christian, resolve all of this. Just marry him. That'll make it all better. So then 18, I'm married to somebody who was actually very dangerous, very abusive, hurt me in lots and lots of different ways, was regularly having affairs. By the time we were 19, he'd be started to having relationships with teenage girls, which I reported to the police, which led to him being convicted of sex offences. He was very sexually abusive, very emotionally damaging to me, which led to me at times being suicidal, self-harming, while also being a teenage mother with a baby, right? And so at 20 I became pregnant again, and I started to get some strength to try and get out. And when I was had just turned 21, he assaulted me, and I was 6 months pregnant, and my son was born 3 months premature. So we then ended up moving to live in a hospital about an hour from our hometown. And so Joshua he was £2.6 when he was born. He was very small. He didn't have a bum, because there wasn't enough meat for the cheeks, bless him. It's just this tiny little, he was only like this big. And
he's going to really thank you for saying that on camera.
Yeah. Yeah, thank you. He was really small, and after about a month of him being in hospital, and he was on a ventilator, he was very, very seriously ill. I lived in the hospital with him, with my daughter, who was 2.5. At the time, my then husband was instigated another relationship with a teenage girl, and I had reported to the police, and the police said she denied it, he denied it. And so anyway, so when we were going through hospital, I discovered he was back having contact with this teenage girl. So that basically was the kind of catalyst to me to just ending the relationship. And so I was living in this hospital with this premature baby and this toddler, and when I was going through all that, after about a month, realizing that actually the reason that this had happened was because of, and this is, I think, something that lots and lots of women experience, is he can do anything he wants to me, but it's when somebody else gets hurt. When Joshua was born premature, I spoke to a woman, and she was with her partner for decades, and he assaulted her mother, and she left him. So I think that when we're with somebody who's abusive, I think women generally are socialized to put other people's needs first. So already we're conditioned to not put ourselves, to not care about ourselves in the way we should, and then we end up in a relationship with someone who's abusive, and then we just think, well, look, I'll put up with it, maybe it's my fault. And then actually it's when somebody else is hurt that we're suddenly like, actually it's gone too far now. They can do whatever they like to us, but when they do something to our kids or to somebody else we care about, that's it. And so so I was living in this hospital, and reported him to the police. And it was really then that actually I discovered God for myself. So as I said, before, I'd grown up in this kind of Christian context, and I knew God was real, but I never heard God, for myself. I'd known God as I suppose a bit like, if you've got this relative that nobody's at, I don't know, a relative that's the stories of this relative are really, really part of the family lore. And they might even be they've either gone to a distant land, so you've never met them, but you know about them, and they're not in contact, but you know about them, and they're really key to how your family function. And so it was almost like, for me, that was my experience of God, as somebody I knew about, and I believed in and knew was real, but I'd never really had a conversation with myself. And living in this hospital, that's when I really profoundly experienced knowing God for myself, and like the distant relatives suddenly coming and living in the house with you. Suddenly you're like, oh, right, this is what you were all talking about. This is amazing. And so, like really, you know, kind of really profoundly, God was really speaking to me about, like, I like heard God audibly speak, not in a kind of weird, like thinking everyone else could hear it, just knowing God speaking to me. And God, like the first thing that I really, like, God would tell me just to read my Bible and not watch TV, just like literally would sit and read this Bible from beginning to end, you know, and pray and just be there with my kids and stuff. And one of the kind of the turning point really for me was God said to me, I need you to love me the same way that Joshua lives or dies. And you know, like, I mean, he was really like ill a lot, like, you know, this was not, but this was like intensive care baby, you know, and he was in there for a long time. At one point they couldn't find any more veins to in IV feed him, or so they had to put one in his head. And then he had bronchiolitis at one point that was so bad that they had to give him a drug to paralyze him so that he couldn't pull his ventilation tube out, because it was, and he was basically about to be sent, he was sent to a specialist hospital in the northeast that deals with lung and heart problems, because he needed a lung bypass, which is where they take the blood out of the body, oxygenate it and put it back in, and there's about a 70 to 80% chance of severe disability. And the doctors were like, I was like, you know, I was like 21 at this point, like totally on some other planet. I was like, but you'll only do that if it's really serious. And they were like, it is serious. We're sending him to by ambulance with, you know, ventilated in this little plastic box to get this surgery, this operation. And he just like, he on the way there he improved and he never needed it. And so, but like that was what we were dealing with on a, like, you know, a day-to-day basis. And I was a 21, I had a 2.5-year-old, and I was doing this as a single parent. And so living in that hospital, and God said to me, you need to trust me the same. And this was like, you know, actually he could die tomorrow, you know. And I went through this process of being like, well, can I do that? Can I make that decision? And having lived with somebody who was so dangerous and damaged me in so many different ways, and you know, and one of the things that an abuser does is they will take away anything that gives you strength, anything that, so anything that could give you strength, the only way it can be used is as a weapon to beat you. It's not allowed to give you strength. And so my faith in that relationship was the thing that meant that I kept forgiving him, that I kept on trying to make things right. So it was used in a way that would keep me there, but I couldn't have a relationship with God, because you cannot, it's impossible, because the abuser will try to strip away anything that gives you strength, which is what God does. And so having lived for 4 years with somebody who wouldn't let me have a relationship with God, I was like, actually, do you know what? Like, if I lost everything and the only thing I had left was God, if my kids were taken from me and all that was left was God, I know that I'd be okay. And so in that moment, I chose to say, I'm going to trust God. Like, and if Joshua dies, and from that day forward, I never prayed that Joshua would live. I just prayed for God's will to be done. And for the rest of my life, actually, that's my prayer. Always. My prayer is, you know, your will be done. Like, it's not, can you make it? You know, I might have ideas about what I'd like to happen, but that fundamentally I'm not interested in what I want to happen. I'm interested in God's will being done, regardless of anything else. And so, so living in this hospital and making that decision to trust God, and you know, Joshua did get better. He's now 15 and pretty amazing. He has some behavioral issues linked to being premature, but his physical health is great. And yeah, and Megan, who's now 17, and so, you know, both of them, it's been complicated and messy. It's not simple. I'm going to get back to your original question in a second.
That's all right.
Yeah, so went through this really, really profound experience of actually the thing that liberated me was dying to all the things I wanted, which is really a very anti-feminist message. It sounds like, actually, it sounds really problematic, but actually, like, in the time since then, the person I've been able to become and the way that I've been able to live has been truly liberating as a woman. And my feminism, I discovered feminism partly through going on a course that helped me to understand I had been abused, because even at this point, after all that stuff, I still hadn't realized that what was going on was abuse. I got referred to a course for women who've been abused, and I was like, oh, I don't need to go to that, but they offered like 2 hours free childcare, so I was like, oh, I'll go because my kids looked after me. And that's when I discovered that first session of that course, after my son had actually come out of hospital by that point, that's when I first discovered that I'd been abused. Like all this stuff had been done to me, and I wouldn't have called it abuse until that point. And so so I think for me, the whole question of the Christian faith and abuse and feminism is really complicated, because I totally recognize why feminists are so opposed to Christianity and to religion, because actually I grew up in a context which really disabled me from making good choices when I met somebody who was abusive. It disabled me from recognizing the abuse. It disabled me from asserting boundaries. It meant that I focused on forgiveness rather than my own well-being or my children's well-being. Do you know what I mean? So like, actually all of that stuff is entirely true, but it's also true that I literally would be dead without Jesus, and I would not have been able to discover the level of liberation that I have without this faith. And so for me, like, I guess I embody this experience of the complexity of faith as an ambiguous resource for women, that it can be really problematic, but it can also be really empowering, liberating. And so I think I think that's answered your question in a round the house.
That's great, Natalie, thank you. It's interesting, isn't it, because elements of the Christian church have used feminism as a way of demonizing some women who stand up for themselves. But what you're saying is that you can be both. You can be Christian and feminist.
Yeah, and I think there's always going to be tension. So, for instance, one of the biggest tensions within, some people might say it's the abortion issue, but actually that's issue based. I'd say on an ideological level, much more kind of stripping it right back, the biggest challenge is that feminism says women need to own themselves, and women need to belong to themselves, and women need to kind of be empowered to make the right choices for their lives, and that kind of stuff. And what Christianity says is death to self is how true liberation comes. So this idea of the self-emptying, the technical name is kenosis, and this idea that we need to die to ourselves. And, in Philippians 2, where it says that God became a human baby and gave up all power. So there is this kind of message of dying to self, which is the thing that is probably most opposed to a feminist analysis. However, the way I make sense of it is you can't die to yourself until you own yourself. And so for most women, kenosis is actually an impossibility, because women are raised within a society where they're told that they should belong to a man, or they should belong their father or their husband, which, historically and within the Bible was how things looked, that society says that they should look a certain way, they should think a certain way, they should feel a certain way, and that they're always wrong and they're always judged. And so women's kind of socialized systems are often towards self-negation in a way that's really toxic and is not honoring of the imago Dei within them. It's not honoring of who God is in them. That we believe as Christians that inside each of us we're created in the image of God, and so that image of God means that we should honor. You can't. It says love your neighbor as yourself. You've got to love yourself, right? Like that's the first bit. In order to, and there's an assumption that to love your neighbor, you do love yourself. And so for women, that assumption is not always accurate. That for lots of women, loving yourself is definitely. I remember reading C.S. Lewis's Mere Christianity, and he talks about how loving the sinner, hating the sin is really easy to understand, because he's always loved himself, but he knows some of the things he does are wrong. And I read that, I was like, I just can't imagine the privilege of being able to go, I've always loved myself. And so for most women, for most of human history, we've not owned ourselves. And so for me, I would say that feminism is the crucial first step in women. Within Christianity, it's the missing piece for a lot of women, is that they haven't known to own themselves, so they don't know how to die to themselves, because how can you die to yourself if you don't own yourself? And so that for me is a tricky thing, and I think that's where feminists would most oppose Christians, that when women are then told to die to themselves, it's like, hang on a second, she's only just started owning herself, why are you wanting her to give herself up? But I think when that comes out of a place of ownership and out of a place of really truly of self-autonomy, then actually self-death and choosing to die to what God wants can be a liberating process, but only if you are in strong enough relationship with God to work out what is patriarchy, what is misogyny, and what is actually God's, because, you know, there is real liberation in that, but you've got to have the ability to discern what that really looks like. And I don't think that's really well developed in most people because they're not encouraged to develop it.
And part of the issue is, it's not that, and I'm not trying to make excuses here, but it's not that church deliberately tries to manipulate and twist, but in effect that's actually what happens, is that things are twisted. So things like, you know, think about other people first. Well, the Bible doesn't actually teach that. You know, it says as well as yourself.
Yeah.
You know, but it's twisted, and it's like, you know, if you think about yourself, if you're doing something for yourself, in some areas it's like you're labelled selfish, uncaring. And so I think there's something in the feminine psyche that wants to be caring, wants to be unselfish in a sense. And it's almost like those kind of things are used to manipulate that desire.
Yeah, and I think what we often see within kind of Christian teaching is a lack of contextualizing. So, you know, I think just kind of going, this is a message for everyone. Like, actually, no, you know, how we've got to look at the context, both the context of the passage, but also the context of ourselves and where are we located. Yeah. So, you know, when you look at, you know, for instance, Jesus' teachings, usually they're stories in which you've got to work out who you are. So if you look at the prodigal son story, there's a story and there's various people in that story, and you've got to work out which person you are in which part of your life at this point in order to apply that story to your life. That's the really profound thing about Jesus' teaching, is it's like multifold. It wasn't like, here's a rule book, follow it. It was like, here's some stories, like, see where you find yourself in them, and how you find you know, how do you navigate yourself in those stories. And so I think, like, yeah, that a lot of the time these kind of messages are decontextualized, and we as human beings become decontextualized, which is irony, given that we have a faith which was about a God coming to make himself part of our context. Like the incarnation is fundamentally about God contextualizing himself in our world and going, actually, in order for me to be able to bring healing and to save this people, this world, I'm gonna have to locate myself in it. And yet we as Christians generally try to decontextualize and delocate it as like universal truths that don't have a context, which is the craziest thing when you think about the meta narratives of scripture.
Yeah Wow, so much in that.
There isn't there? I was just like, oh wow, I've got to think a bit more about that.
And sometimes you find yourself saying things, you go, oh, I didn't know I knew that. Yeah. But, you know, one of the things I found fascinating in the book, you know, obviously you unpack what abuse is, what kind of identifiers, you know, you talk about the isolator, brainwasher, threatener, all of those kind of things. But you say that abuse is not a relationship issue. And so sometimes, especially in church, I think, we try to address it by marriage counselling, marriage therapy. And you say that in cases of domestic abuse, that's not actually a helpful solution. What, can you unpack that a little bit?
Yeah, so the biggest problem the church has with abuse is misdiagnosis. So the church does lots of really terrible things around when they found out somebody is being abused. They do lots of really problematic or harmful things. But that's because usually by the time they start doing them, they've decided it's not abuse. So because what actually happens is, most people, if you were to ask a church leader or you to ask somebody in a congregation, like, what would you do if somebody was being abused by their husband? Most of the time, yes, you get like really hardline kind of fundamentalists who would be like, well, I'd tell her to forgive, you know, and obviously we've got teaching out there that says that sort of thing. But for the vast majority of like people located in churches today, if you were to ask them, what would you do if someone was being abused in your congregation? They would be like, we'll be horrified, and we would challenge it, and we would support her, and we wouldn't expect her to stay, and we would want to get her all the support she needs, and we'd find somewhere for her to go. You know, those are the sorts of theoretical ideas people will have. Yeah. The problem is that when they are confronted by abuse, they've already done this work of deciding it's not abuse. And so they misdiagnose it as something else. So they'll go, a woman will come and say, you know, I'm really scared of my husband. Now their husband's a member of the preaching team or the music team, and this person that they're disclosing to says, thinks, well, he's not scary, he's lovely. I mean, maybe there must be more going on here, because my assessment of this person is that they're safe. And so if their experience of them is unsafe, there's probably something, you know, is she quite anxious? Is there, you know, do they need help with how to talk more kindly to each other? Does she need to learn how to say I statements, not you statements? Do you know what I mean? Like, you can see it, can't you? The minute somebody comes with a problem in that is located within their relationship, the first question is, because we also have this idea that we're all sinners and fallen short of the glory of God, right? The first thing is that we all must be at fault. Like, that's what that narrative basically leads to. It's not intentional. That's not what we think we're saying. But that is what we're saying, that we all must be at fault. So
you're asking her, what's she doing wrong?
Yeah, not because you actually think she should be to blame for abuse, but because if we're all sinners, then in any situation where there's an interpersonal problem, everybody must have a part to play. And so what she needs to do is work out her part in that, and then we'll work out what his part in it is.
It's always that whole thing of like, well, it takes two to tango.
Yeah, of course. It is like, because, and actually that can be true for lots of relationship issues, but just because something takes place in the context of a relationship doesn't mean it's a relationship issue. So when he is abusing her, that is an abuse issue, and the location of the issue is in him. So if we look at, like, if this is two people, right, and relationship problems exist in the middle space between those two people, yeah? I've just realised, for people who are listening and not looking, they're going to be like, what is this? So if you've got a person on one side and a person on the other side, and in the middle is where the relationship problems exist between those two people. And actually, the current definition of domestic abuse in the UK reinforces that. It says, you know, an acts of like abuse between two people. So actually, even in our kind of, is codified in our legal, and not legal, but in our kind of language around abuse, is this idea of it being between. But actually, abuse happens from one person to another. The reason that it's abuse is that it is one way to the other person. The reason it is abuse is because one person, when somebody is abusive, what they believe is that I own my partner and I'm entitled to get one.
That's the thing, the ownership thing.
Yeah, and so you can't fix that by solving the relationship problem, because relationship problems are not about one person thinking they own and are entitled over another person. Like, that's not, like, no marriage course is designed to solve that problem, because that's not a relationship or marriage problem, that's an abuser problem.
So I guess there's a difference between an abusive relationship and a volatile relationship then. You know, relationships can be volatile but not necessarily abusive in that sense.
Yeah, so I would say I never use the term abusive relationship, because I think it reinforces this idea that it's a relationship problem. So, but it is, and lots of domestic abuse services use it. Like, this isn't like just like a layperson's thing. Lots of people use it for lots of reasons, but it's wrong, and we should not use it. So I'd say, I think we've got to be careful, because I think once we start saying there could be a volatile relationship that's not abuse, that then creates yet another barrier to women getting the help they need, because then people will go, oh, it's one of those volatile relationships we've heard of. So immediately, basically, I would say that where somebody is coming to you and talking about being fearful, talking about being undermined, talking about being talking in a way that sounds like and actually often, usually somebody who's being abused will feel like it's their fault, so they'll be saying, I keep winding him up, I keep upsetting him. So to some degree, those people outside that situation who go, oh, well, we need to help you with your confidence, or we need to help you, they're doing that partly because they're listening to what the person's saying, who's saying, I keep upsetting my husband and now he's hurting me. Like, they're hearing what she's saying, but actually, like, this is why discernment and wisdom and being kind of really listening to people is important, because if he's hitting her and she's saying, I've made him hurt me, or if he's controlling her in some ways, if he's saying she shouldn't see her mum anymore, or that she shouldn't go to church anymore, or that she shouldn't she should be doing different things with the kids. You know, actually we need to just ask we need to be asking more questions, I think, rather than just accepting at face value somebody's assessment, which I think is good pastoral practice, right? Yeah. Like, it's good pastoral practice to be just not to be questioning them about whether what they're saying is true, but kind of asking, oh, like, what is the context of
what's
this?
behind,
And like what was, you know, what has been going on that's led to this, you know, like to try to gather more information. But essentially the problems that Christians have are generally that they misdiagnose an abuser as a difficult relationship.
Right.
And so then the problem become about the relationship. The second, so that's first step. The first step is they see it as a relationship issue and not an abuse issue. The second step is when they do realize it's an abuse issue, they then start to legitimize the reasons why the man's abusive, particularly if they like him. So they'll be like, oh, well, you know, he's had a hard childhood and he's, you know, he's struggling with pornography, and he's, you know, like, and suddenly, because what they don't want to accept is there's someone in their midst who is abusive and they didn't know, who is deliberately hurting their partner. So one of the things we don't talk very often about is the fact that it's actually really beneficial to be abusive. Now, I hope nobody's listening to this or watching this is like, oh, she's advocating this. I'm not advocating abuse, but being abusive actually has a lot of benefits. And within the church, we assume that if somebody's abusive, they're a tortured soul who's having a terrible time. Do you know who's having a terrible time when someone's abusive? The person who's being abused. Like, the abuser is not having a terrible time. And it's this idea that he must be tortured in some way and wounded in some way that's causing, you know, like the hurt people type rhetoric. Like this idea that he's the hurt one. Do you know who's the hurt one? She is. The kids are the hurt ones. Stop putting all your emotional, you know, your compassion into him, because he's not the one. He's the one who's causing the pain here. And yes, he might have his own pain, but fixing his pain is not actually going to stop him being abusive. What's going to stop him being abusive is recognizing that he believes he owns his partner and he believes he's entitled to do what he wants to her. And until he stops thinking that, he's going to be abusive, no matter how much counselling you give him.
But then the problem is that the patriarchal element of church encourages that idea.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Like, this is like, so this idea that one of the things that I often talk about when people ask me about kind of headship and submission in churches which advocate for headship and submission, that I'll often talk about that actually, churches who are that would be termed complementarian. So churches that believe that men and women are complementary from each other and so have different gifts and different skills and different callings because of those complementary gifts. Now, those churches can be very good. Often they're not, but they can be very good at supporting somebody who's being abused. Like, there's no reason why believing that stuff means you can't help people who are being abused. But you cannot speak to the fundamental beliefs of an abuser, because if you think that men are called to have leadership over women, you are advocating that God has given that men have God-given entitlements. They have God-given entitlements. Yeah, you can say all you like that it's about leadership which is servant-hearted and it's about sacrificial leadership, but you are saying that men are entitled to things that women are not entitled to, and and that's that on a kind of not kind of biologically, but in terms of what they should be allowed to do or have or be. And so you create a system in which you perpetuate, you know, for somebody who's not abusive, complementarian theology isn't necessarily a problem, because, you know, the vast majority of people who successfully live in complementarian relationships do so because the man is not abusive. And because actually, if the woman says, I want to do this, I want to do that, generally, they'll agree that can happen because they actually function as egalitarian, which is the other form of theology where men and women are equal, because actually the man doesn't take ownership and doesn't take those entitlements. And that basically, almost that's what's argued, is that complementarian says, but, you know, God gives men power over women, and men choose not to take that power in a way that at all they choose to kind. Do you know what I mean? It's like so, but actually this theology is very, very dangerous in the hands of somebody who's abusive, because it legitimizes that they're right, and it legitimizes to their partner or to their spouse, to their wife, that actually that's how things should be. And so both parties there's a theological legitimizing of this abuse. So I think that's the next barrier, is this, well, he must be there must be something wrong that we need to fix in him, rather than actually, do you know what's wrong? That we need to look after her, we need to care for her, we need to support her needs, rather than him.
Yeah, that's really interesting. But it leads me to then ask, so, I mean, obviously you talked about there are men who believe that kind of theology who are not abusive.
Yeah.
So are some men born abusers?
No.
Or does
No.
something happen to make them abusers? Or
Usually it's about trial and error, and it's about the socializing messages. So all men are socialized into patriarchal ideas of masculinity.
yeah,
Lots of men cannot meet those patriarchal demands.
yeah.
So if you go to school and you don't like the things that you're supposed to like to be a man or a boy, you
Football
will,
girls.
yeah, if you go to secondary school and you don't like football and you don't like competitiveness and you don't like if you don't like a lot of those things, you'll discover quite quickly that patriarchy and masculinity is not benefiting you as much as that guy over there who is kind of really hyper masculine. There's a scale around that.
I've
Yeah.
looked at those guys. They were good at football. They were handsome. It's like
So you discover quite early, there is a group of men who discover as young boys that actually this system is not benefiting them. And so there's lots and lots of men who grow up and discover very quickly that later on in the book I talk about the protective factors to protecting boys from growing up and being abusers. So some of that is about some of it's just that some children their personality is naturally more or less inclined towards dominant kind of, for instance, I would have probably would have done fine as a boy in school. It wasn't great as a girl, but as a boy, because I'm quite loud and I'm quite, my husband is much more traditionally how you would expect a woman to be, and I'm much more traditionally how you'd expect a man to be. So for him, growing up in school, he learned very early on that these systems of patriarchal dominance of men over women, actually it didn't help him, because he wasn't able to pass the man test, really. Do you know what I mean? And so I think that some of it's about that. I think then on top of that, you've got experiences of, parenting, how you're parented. If you're parented in a way where you're raised with entitlement, that's going to have, so if you're given everything you want and you're spoiled, that potentially is going to lead to you as an adult thinking that people owe you something. And particularly if you've been socialized as a boy into one day you'll have a wife and she'll have some nice children for you, if those are the messages you're hearing, again, those things are going to contribute.
And I guess if you grow up in the context where your mum does the cooking, the cleaning, the washing, the tidying up,
And if you go straight from there into a relationship with a woman and living with a woman, and you don't actually have a prolonged period where you have to look after yourself without your mother doing all your washing still, then you've got certain ideas about and certain skills that you haven't developed, right? And so you go into a relationship. If you start a relationship with somebody who kind of just does those things, and then what happens is she then moans and says, I don't want to do all this anymore. And so he's like, well, I don't want to do it. And so what he does is he does the washing badly and he puts a pink sock in there. And then she's like, oh, well, that, why did you do that? And he's like, and then does it work? Because actually a lot of what abuse is finding out it works. Yeah. So when I go into that first relationship and so there's the story of this guy who was a self-confessed gaslighter who makes his, basically has relationships with women and makes them think they're going mad, right? He didn't wake up one day and think, I want to make women think they're going mad when they're in a relationship with me. What happened was he was cheating on his girlfriend and his girlfriend suspected it. And so he said to her, when she went, you're cheating on me, and the first words out of his mouth were, you're paranoid, you are paranoid, you think I'm cheating on you, is you. She's grown up in a society which says women are paranoid that men are cheating on them. She's been raised in a society which says women are mad, right? She then immediately goes, to his surprise, she goes, oh, am I? Is it me then? And he says, yeah, it's you. And then discovers it works. So a lot of abuse is trial and error. Abusers don't start off being violent, horrible people, they start off like trying things and realizing it works, and they don't have to take responsibility, and they get away with bad behavior, so they do it again and they discover it works again. And so abusers are people who it's learned behavior. And obviously if you've grown up in a household where you've seen a man treat a woman like that, you're learning very clearly. And like, actually most men who grow up in households where they see a woman being abused by a man do not become abusive. And you are not more likely as a woman to become abusive if you've grown up in a household where you've seen a man be abusive to a woman, or vice versa. As a man, if you grow up in a household where you see a woman being abusive to a man, you are not more likely to become abusive. So this isn't about trauma being enacted in your life. It's about the fact that you're learning what the role of a man is, and you're learning what the role of a woman is. So this is about learned behavior that starts in the macro of the society and the laws and the media, and then it gradually comes into your community, your peer group, your parents. All of those things are creating a context which is either less or more conducive to you developing those beliefs. And then you go into relationships, and then you gradually learn, oh, I can get away with this, I can get away with that. And so that's why our job as a society is to reduce the conducive context, to make a smaller and smaller window in which men can develop those sorts of beliefs. So it's how we raise our boys.
I think it's fascinating that you're saying that the figures, the research shows that just because you observe abuse in your family doesn't necessarily create an abuser.
No, like it absolutely doesn't. Not at all.
My initial thought would have been, well, there you go, that's all they've known.
No, it's about 50% of abusers will have seen a male role model be abusive to a woman, but 50% haven't. So it's not a kind of and it's really offensive, like lots and lots of boys who grow up seeing their mums being abused, they grow up wanting to protect women and being horrified by that. It's like deeply offensive to say that will turn somebody into an abuser. Like very, very often it doesn't. And women are more likely to be abused as children, and women are not more likely to become abusive. So there's a maths problem that if you're saying, right, so women, kind of proportionally more women are abused, but like in adult it shrinks and there's hardly any women are abusers, unless boys are abused, but like by adulthood loads of boys are abusive. There's something about what's going on there is much more about a much broader conversation about, it's not about some people are born evil or not evil. I believe that everybody is born in the image of God. It is that actually we are planted in a garden when we're born and that soil and all of the things, other plants in that garden and the climate, all of those things are going to shape what that plant looks like. And so it's why we do have a power to affect change, because and this is the thing about being Christians. I don't know how anybody can do the sort of work I do and not have a faith in something beyond this life, because I tell you, like, I don't expect to change everything now, but I do believe there will come a world where everything will be different. But yeah, I think we need to we need to develop contexts that are not conducive to abusers growing, and that's all of our responsibilities. That's about what do we accept from somebody we know. If somebody makes a joke about their wife, do we challenge it? If somebody makes a joke about women being under the thumb, do we challenge it? Do we speak out against the use of pornography because it's causing men to develop bad ideas about what women want? Do you know what I mean? So for instance, the evidence of this being a socialized problem, 20 years ago, 20, 30 years ago, it would have been quite unusual for men to strangle women during sex. Like that would have been generally perceived as sexual violence.
So that's a modern thing then?
Yeah. So now, like, obviously there would have been abusers who would have strangled their partner, but now 40% of women, 70% of women report being strangled during sex under 40, or choked, had their hair pulled, being spat at, like lots of forms of violence within consensual sex. So this isn't like somebody who's attacking them. This is within a sexual encounter they've engaged in, willingly. 30% of those, that group, so like 30% of the 70, no, like not 30% of the 70, that would be wrong, but basically 30% of the whole 100 said they wanted to have those acts done to them. 40% did not, and were like, just literally, women will report that when they're just having sex, the boyfriend or the guy they're having sex with will literally just put their hand over their mouth or choke them, or will start pulling their hair or spitting on them, and they're like, where did that come from? And you know where it's come from? It's come from pornography. So that's what pornography shows. Those are the sorts of acts that pornography shows all the time, and so that's why our sexual scripts are being developed through that. So it's not that suddenly men woke up one day and suddenly loads of them were choking women. It's actually that these men probably wouldn't have choked women. Similarly, COVID is another conducive context. So you might have a guy who, on a number of occasions, has tried to coerce a woman into moving in with him really early on, right? Because thinking, if we get moved in, then she can start doing my washing and my ironing and my cleaning, and I'll get to see her more, and she'll stop seeing her friends as much, and I'll get her all to myself. Yeah, I'll get her all to myself. I'll get, all of this kind of thing, right? And he's tried it with a few women, and they're like, this is too intense. Like, I don't want this. Right now, we've got a global pandemic which says you can't have any physical contact with someone unless you're living with them or unless you're in a bubble with them, right? So this couple, then he goes, why don't you just move in? We want to see each other more. So suddenly she moves in, and suddenly now he's going to trial and error stuff to see how he gets what he wants. And so whereas prior to that guy might never have escalated his abusive tendencies, because he wouldn't have had a context in which a woman would have been happy to do that, because the context wouldn't have allowed for it. Whereas now COVID is creating a context. A lot of abusers are talking about, you're going to give me COVID if you do that, or you can't go out because you're going to catch COVID and give it to the kids and then they're going to die. No, up until last January, that was not an argument that would have ever worked with an abuser. So what it is about seeing is all the different tools that an abuser can develop, and whether the context is encouraging those tools or against those tools.
Wow, that's incredible. This blows my mind. Wow. Now, in the book, we're running out of time. I don't want to take up too much of your appointment time, but you've got a chapter called "What Would Jesus Do?" and you talk about, as a kid having the bracelets, but obviously you're addressing what God would say and do in response to domestic abuse. So what is God's thoughts on this? What's his approach to this? What's the theological underpinning of combating abuse?
Yeah, I think it's always difficult to go, what would God say? There's a bit of hubris there, isn't there, of thinking you can say.
That's why I was saying, what's the theological underpinning?
What do we do? Where do I see God?
How does the church respond? All of that kind of stuff.
So I would say that Jesus said that he came to bring life in its fullness. And so I think fundamentally, where life is not in all its fullness, the church, Christians, have a responsibility to be part of working out why life isn't in all its fullness, and working towards enable it to be that. And some of that is about our belief in kind of a spiritual plane, and about our understanding of that actually some of life in all its fullness, or that Jesus brings life in all its fullness through kind of people becoming people of faith, and through them seeing Jesus's liberation. But I think it's also about all the other stuff that that is contributing to life not being in its fullness, and that we can be part of bringing God's truth into. So wherever the truth sets us free, right? And so I think that Christians, theologically, we have a responsibility to become more literate about abuse, because how can we bring life in all its fullness into a context which we don't understand, into an issue that we have that we basically have a load of wrong ideas on? That's a lot. So I think there's lots of responsibility for people to learn about this. This is not just me trying to tell people to read my book, but I think they would find that would be a useful first step.
Well, I highly recommend your book, Natalie. I find it fascinating, excellent, challenging.
Thank you. I'm not paying you or anything either. So, but yeah. So I think there's something about us learning about this stuff so that we can really truly understand it, because there's Barbara Brown Taylor talks about the gift of disillusionment, that actually disillusionment we have this idea that disillusionment is bad, but disillusionment is about the removal of illusions. It's actually about truth. And so we have a responsibility to work towards our own disillusionment on any issue that we don't understand properly. And so I think that there's something about Christians really, because there's lots of things I can talk about theologically, but I think that unless you understand what's really going on with abuse, you're going to continue to respond wrongly to it, because you're going to misdiagnose it. So I think we need to learn and we need to understand. And I think beyond that, when we're thinking about life in all its fullness, if somebody comes to us and talks about how their partner is behaving in ways that are harmful, we need to be thinking about how do we bring life in all its fullness to that person. And one of the things that will involve is doing the opposite that the abuser is doing. So we may say the opposite, like you should leave, if he's saying you have to stay. But what we're both doing is telling her what to do. So what we need to do instead is we need to be doing the opposite. So if he says you're worthless, we need to say you are amazing. Like when he's reducing her choices, we need to show her there's loads more choices out there, that she, that the world doesn't have to look how he makes it, because he's doing, the devil's work, essentially, like steal, killing and destroying, right? And so, that's the context in which Jesus, says, the enemy comes to steal, kill and destroy, and I come to give you life in all its fullness. So our job as Christians is to discern where is there steal, killing and destroying going on, and how do we bring life in all its fullness?
Because that's a really interesting approach, Natalie, because my instant reaction would be, right, we need to get you out of there, we need to get you to a hostel or to another home or something. But again, I hadn't thought about it, but that's taking the power out of her hands.
Yeah, like just telling her what to do. And actually, like, what the evidence shows is that it's much more possible for a woman to stay left if she plans to leave and does it gradually and slowly. So if somebody discloses to us that their partner's abusive, we might want to jump into immediately rushing into getting her out of there. But actually, we need to do the work of making her sure that's what she wants to do. But B, there's lots of things we might need to put in place. The most dangerous point for a woman is, in terms of her partner killing her, is when she leaves or within 18 months of leaving. So when we advise women to leave, we are potentially asking them to risk murder, like being murdered by their partner. And so we need to make sure we're partnering with specialist services, and the specialist services are massively over capacity and underfunded, so we might need to support them in building that capacity as well. But we need to make sure that we're doing this gradually. Like if you think about it, this woman is not just leaving a dangerous person, she's also leaving the person she committed to spend her life with. That I think when we move into this, we need to rescue her. We see him as the enemy, and we stop seeing her as a woman whose relationship's breaking down, because it is a relationship. The problem is not the relationship, but it is a relationship. That's her children's father. If she leaves, there's all these things are going to change. Like society is not kind to single parents. Like the church is even more unkind to single parents. Well, actually, they're all right if they're not Christian, right?
My mum was one.
Non-Christian single parents, fine, because we can save them and then be lovely. But if they're a Christian and they get divorced or become a single parent, they're not going to experience a lot of benefits to that in the church or in society. So we need to recognize there's lots and lots of barriers to somebody leaving, and our job is not just to be like, you need to go. Our job is, how do we help them to deconstruct those barriers for themselves, and how do we support them in removing those barriers? Because there's so much going on. So I think, that practically that's what we need to do. In terms of our theology, we've got to think about a theology of power, a theology of gender, and a theology of relationships, because fundamentally abuser is seeking to have power over their partner, is seeking to control them, have power over them as a result of these beliefs of ownership and entitlement. So we need to be thinking about, how do we model power? How do we speak about power? Who is seen as important in our community? What does it mean to have power, and what does it mean to give it up? And also, what does it mean to learn to own ourselves before we do that giving up, if we don't already own ourselves? And the second thing is gender. Like, we need to think about, what is our teaching about women and men? Does when the pastor gets up, if it's a man or a woman, are they making sexist jokes about how hot their spouse is? Are they like making jokes about, how does Father's Day get handled? How does Mother's Day get handled? What sort of messages are we sending about what we think men and women should be? So what is our theology of women and men? Like, are we perpetuating ideas of headship and submission? If we're not, we are still within a context where that's quite normal. So what are we doing to combat and to make sure that our church is explicitly challenging that? Do we Do we ever talk about the female attributes of God? The fact that God is never described as having a penis, but is described as having a womb. Do you know, like, do we talk about that in our churches? Do we talk about the fact that the word for God's compassion is womb, that the Holy Spirit is described using feminine kind of pronouns, feminine, like, and not those pronouns, you know, not technically, but you know, that actually that is a thing. Do we talk about those things? Do we not just kind of passively assume that because we women can lead here, that everybody understands that God values women? You know, do we make sure that women are being asked to preach as much as men? Do we make sure that we are doing, you know, kind of the discipleship of those that we see with the leadership gifting? Are they all being discipled towards a pathway of leadership that is non-gendered? You know what I mean? So there's all sorts of things we need to think about in terms of how are we proactively living out a faith that liberates women, as opposed to it just being something that we implicitly think we think but haven't really done a lot of work on. And then our theology of relationships. When we preach about forgiveness, are we saying that doesn't mean you should accept an abuser hurting you? You know, like for me, I've discovered that forgiveness does not mean nullifying the consequences of what someone does to us, because you can't. You know, I will forever be traumatized.
It leaves us scars.
Yeah, forever. I've got 2 children who, like, their biological father is very dangerous. Like, I can't, no forgiveness is going to make him nice. No forgiveness is going to mean that having contact with him is going to be anything other than very, very dangerous for them. You know, so, but actually lots of people would think that forgiveness means they have to have a relationship with him, because forgiveness and reconciliation are not the same thing. You know, and Joseph is a model for forgiveness. Joseph said, I am not going to become vulnerable to my brothers until I've tested them. And so he tested how did they behave towards Benjamin. That's why he did all that. He did all that because he was like, I'm not going to show them myself. I'm not going to trust them again until I've seen how they treat the other person, the brother who was like the same as me, who was the same, had the same mother, and the brother who's the youngest. And when he saw that they protected Benjamin, that they changed, that's when he was like, I'm your brother. Like, he didn't do that until he could be sure. And so our model of forgiveness needs to have like a way of testing whether this person is safe. Otherwise, what we're doing is what the devil did in that sounded a bit dramatic, didn't it? But when Jesus is tested by the devil takes him up to a high point and says, jump down there. The Lord your God will save you. And Jesus says, do not test the Lord your God. When we are pushing people into relationships with dangerous people under the guise of forgiveness, we are asking them to test the Lord their God. They know this person is dangerous. Why would you encourage them to test God in whether he's going to be safe? He's not safe.
It's enabling, isn't it?
Yeah. And fundamentally, we need to understand that if while we create conducive context for abuse, while we don't challenge this stuff, while we encourage women to stay with people who are dangerous, what we are doing is we are enabling sin. And if there's something we can all be sure God hates, it's sin. And so if nothing else, our responsibility to that perpetrator is to enable them to stop sinning, is to work with them in a way that is going to prevent them continuing sinning. And if we understand that abusers' behavior is trial and error, that if we need to create context where that trial and error doesn't work, where every time they try to do something abusive, it doesn't work. And the problem is, at the minute, when abusers are doing all this toxic stuff, the church is generally supporting them. You know, well, he should see his children. You know, fathers should see their children, but, you know, like, and all of that kind of stuff. And so we have to make it so when abusers try to be abusive, they discover it doesn't work. And the more that they discover that, the more they're going to stop. They're going to realize they can't do that. You know, the reasons abusers abuse is because they can. So we have to stop it. We have to make it so they can't. It's complicated.
Yeah, but I love the quote that you give from Dr. Liz Kelly and Dr. Nicola Westmoreland. They write, can a leopard change its spots? No, because a leopard is born with spots. It does not make the choice to continue to have them. Men are not born violent. They derive benefits from not being held accountable for the use of violence and abuse. And just as they make decisions about other areas of their lives, they can choose to stop being violent and abusive. Perpetrator programs can help them make those changes. I love that. That really spoke to me, that quote, you know, from your book, that it kind of sums up what you were saying about the socialization, you know, and the testing and trying to see where are the boundaries, what can I get away with, but they, if we don't challenge it, if we don't say, why are you saying that about your wife? Why are you speaking to her? Then it's just going to escalate, isn't it? And like you said, it can, in some cases, escalate to murder.
Yeah, and I think sometimes it's just about not laughing. That's what my husband, particularly in like male only groups where, kind of sexist jokes are told, and he's just like, not funny. Just like, it does mean you're a bit of the killjoy, but actually, it works, because you won't be the only person in that room that's uncomfortable. And, so I think we have that responsibility to reduce the space that abusers have to abuse. And churches are in a massively strong position to do that if they choose to take that responsibility seriously.
Yeah. But I loved the last little bit of that. Perpetrator programs can help them make those changes. So it's not just that you need to change, but here's something that can show you how to change.
Yeah, and a perpetrator program, so the Respect, the National Perpetrator Helpline. If people Google Respect phone line, they can find out more. That you can ring them and they'll tell you where your nearest perpetrator program is and what resources there are. I think the thing is, the challenge with perpetrator programs is they can help somebody to change, but they're only spending maybe like 3 hours a week in the perpetrator program. Then they go into the world so I think the thing is, that alongside perpetrator programs, we need to be building a society where there's less space for abusers to enact those abusive behaviors. Because if they're going into a session which says no, your wife isn't a possession that you own, and then they go home and watch porn, like, do you know what I mean? Like, they're going to be like, oh well, women are supposed to be used and abused, and so like when everything we do on this there's nothing neutral. We're either reinforcing or challenging abusers' ideas. And so it's about thinking in every interaction, in every word we use, and everything we do, we need to be thinking about how are we challenging or reinforcing. I should have said, I think I've mentioned my husband, like, since I talked about my story, I should have said that I got remarried. This is like a different husband. I always say he's the good one, the good husband. So yes, I got remarried. We've been married for 13 years now, and it's been great. So I think I think there's it's important that we do this challenging, but I just thought I'd better put that in there in case it was like, what? I don't understand. It's like, yeah, no, it's a new one. Yeah.
Upgraded, a new model.
Yeah.
But Natalie, this has been such a joy for me. I could spend another hour or so with you. This is great stuff. Do you have any last words for our listeners?
I think if anybody's listening to this and they're recognizing anything that I've said that could feel like there's abuse going on in their situation or with somebody they care about, if it's safe to use a computer, lots of abusers control women through keeping, looking on their computer and stuff. So obviously you might need to use someone else's computer or whatever, or a phone or whatever, or make sure you delete your history and that kind of stuff. But if you search domestic abuse and your local area, you'll probably be able to find out what the local helpline is. There's a national helpline which is 0808 2000 24/7, but it's really overly subscribed. So local services are going to be able to help you much better than the national service will. So if you can't find a local service, do call them 0808 2000 24/7. And even if it's not you that's being abused, but you're listening to this and you're recognizing there's somebody that you care about who might be being abused, you can contact one of those local helplines and they will be able to advise you on how to support a family member or friend. So I think I would say, if this is going on for you or for someone you care about, like, one of the most radical things that women can do is to trust their own feelings and to trust their instincts, that we're taught so often to shut down. Oh, it's me, I'm just making it up, there's nothing really bad going on. Like, so I always say this to girls as well, trust yourself. So I think if you're listening to this and any of this has made you feel a bit like, oh, is that going on, don't squash it down. And we're all tempted to do that because it makes life a lot simpler if it's not abuse. But if there is stuff going on that you're like, maybe that is what's going on, do some investigating, do some listening, reading up, and my book might help. It's got lots of stuff around being able to recognize what abuse actually tangibly looks like, which we haven't talked about a lot today, so that might be really helpful to have a read through. And just if you're in a position where you are supporting people, keep on keeping on, loving them and being there unconditionally. You know, I think it can be really hard if we're supporting someone and they go back to their partner and we've invested all this and then suddenly they're back there. You know, actually we need to be working in ways that are sustainable, that mean that if it takes, you know, 20 years, that we can still be there for that person, that we can still love them and walk with them on that journey that they're going on. So I think those are just some kind of more stuff for people who might be listening and struggling in some way. So yeah.
Thank you. And do you have a website where people can check out your work?
People go to nataliecollins.info. They can find out more about my work, and they can find me on Twitter as @GodLovesWomen with underscores between the words. If you go on there, you can follow me on there, and I usually spend a lot of time ranting, and there's a few pictures of the dog and cats. It's not all miserable. So yeah.
This is not all the heavy stuff. Sometimes there's some.
No. And even to be fair, though, even with the book, I tried to write it in a way that, like, I found that when I started writing it, I'd originally planned to share my story throughout the book, and I'd planned to sort of share my story at the end, because normally when I speak and train and stuff, I share my story at the end of training. But I found that my tone in the book was like, oh, have a bit of cake now. This is a bit sad. Let's do. And I was like, there's no way I can have that tone without explaining it's my own story, or it just sound a bit like really heartless. So yeah. So the book itself is designed to be, you know, I'm generally a fun person, so like, you know, it's interesting being in this line of work. But I think, you know, actually there's something about laughter and joy that when we've been subjected to abuse, that there's something about being able to laugh and find joy, and even in the ludicrousness of how abusers behave, that actually is part of that healing and part of that recovery in and of itself. Yeah.
Oh, thank you so much, Natalie.
Thank you for having me.
Oh, it's been a joy. I've learned from you. Thank you. Thank you for the work that you do. Thank you for coming and sharing with us today and just being you.
Thank you.